Hello, so our focus for today is going to be analyzing the characteristics of Islamic sacred spaces and how they relate to the religious beliefs. So I just wanted to review with you what kind of imagery we will typically see in Islamic art and the reasons why. So keep in mind that typically we have the COG. We have calligraphy, which is the highest, most revered art form. We have the O, which is the arabesque or the organic, right? So we have vegetated imagery. And then we also have geometry. So things are organized within frames, but also you can see tiles and how the imagery continues from one tile to the other. So the reason is that there is a forbiddance of idols and imagery, and it comes from some of the early teachings from Muhammad. It's not to say that we don't have figurative works, but we typically don't have them if they are associated with religion. So we're going to talk about different dynasties and different groups of Muslims throughout. And so you want to focus on the ones that are in the identification. After the death of Muhammad, you remember that there were several civil wars that broke out in the Islamic communities. And a series of them kind of would gain power and kind of go to different places in different territories. And so we're going to focus on one of these early periods called the Abbasid dynasty. And so they ruled as caliphs until about 861, and their capital city was Baghdad, and they had a large palace city in Samarra. And so that's actually where we're going to start our discussion of looking at mosques. So we have seen two structures so far, the Kaaba, which is a more like a monument in a mosque, and then we also looked at the Dome of the Rock, which is not it's a holy site. It's not a mosque either. And so the first style of a mosque is what we call a hypostyle mosque. And so we know hypostyle halls already. We learned about them in ancient Egypt, and we've talked about them since. And so when you look at a style of a hypostyle mosque, the illustration that you have on the screen right now, it looks pretty familiar to us. I think we can identify where this style comes from. It has a lot of connection with ancient Rome, and that makes sense because ancient Rome was powerful and it reached into many of these territories that we're talking about. So at the very edge here, you can see that it's fortified, right? So it's fortified, there's some thick walls, and then there's a large courtyard. So in this very bottom part here, there would be a courtyard. And then that's where people might meet. There'll be like a fountain there for purification. And then if you look across here, there's a series of dots that go the whole entire length, right? Those dots are columns, and that's what makes this a hypostyle hall. This would have had a roof that was that covered a series in rows of columns. So you'll notice that once again, that everything is directed towards this wall here. Okay, so in your study guide, we have this basic orientation, and this is very similar to the mosque at Cordoba. So the different parts of a typical mosque, right? This little square that we have back down here is where we're going to have the minaret. And we'll see what that looks like in 3 dimensions in just a little bit. But that's where the prayer tower is. So 5 times a day, prayer will be called from that location. Then we have these rows, and that leads us to this wall at the end. And that's called the Qibla wall. So this is called the Qibla wall. That is the wall that denotes that that's the direction to Mecca. And so Mecca is the holy city in Islam. That is the city that Muhammad retook. And in the very center of that wall, we have our mihrab. So the mihrab is a niche. It's not an altar. Nothing takes place there. There's no holy books. There's no nothing. It's just a small niche carved into the wall that tells you that that is the direction to Mecca. All of those halls, right, also, right, are directional, and people would be laying on their prayer mats, row by row by row, all facing towards Mecca. So here is the diagram that's in the textbook at the Great Mosque for Cordoba. It's a little bit this is not quite everything. This is after an extension, but we'll see it even bigger. And another part that you'll see here is the Maksura. Maksura is basically when we saw kind of that gated area where the iconostasis is, that is very similar in a mosque as well. It doesn't have icon imagery in it, but it would have an area that would be separate for high officials. Okay. So this is the Great Mosque at Samarra. You can see the minaret is this spiral minaret. It's amazing. And then you can see the fortified walls around it. I think in this example on the bottom left, the angle, you can really see how large that courtyard was. And then you see all of the hypo-style halls. The roof is obviously gone, but you can see that basic format. This is extremely early mosque, based on the format really of a Roman house, right, with an atrium and so on. Here's a close-up of that spiral. Get a feel for how big it is. Look at, there's a person climbing it right there. This is the Great Mosque in Tunisia. And so you can see here that it would have had a roof. And you see that there's a regional style to many of these mosques. So this one doesn't have the spiral minaret. Instead, it has a stacked squared one. And then in this one, and very typical of other mosques as well, that there often is a central dome and then a dome on top of the mihrab on that Qibla wall that denotes the direction to Mecca. So we're going to move to the medieval period of Islamic art and be looking at the Spanish Umayyad dynasty. They ruled until 750 when they were overthrown by the Abbasids. They were one of the first Islamic dynasties, and they were eventually exiled from Damascus, right? And they were exiled to Spain, and they actually ruled in Spain from about 756 to about 1031. So the mosque that we have in the hypostyle form is the Great Mosque of Cordoba. We have several mosques called the Great Mosque, and so it's really important that you learn the different locations for each of them. So this one is in Spain. It was built on top of a Roman temple that was dedicated to Janus, and it was later converted into a church by the Visigoths in 572. If you look at it carefully, you actually can see that there's a church smack dab in the middle of it, and then it became a mosque in 786. It actually went back to being a church, and you can still go inside that church today, and you can also go inside the mosque. It's one of the reasons it's in such good condition. So you have this picture in your 250 slides. And I honestly don't think they really care that you know a lot about the church format or really know a lot about the religious context of Christianity in this image. I think the whole reason they included this is to be understanding the back and forth between Christianity and Islam, and knowing that depending on who was in power, depended on what was the function of the building. So kind of repeating once again that this once housed a church, then it was a mosque, and then it was a church again. There are several gates that allow you to enter into the thick walls of the Mosque of Cordoba. And it's very common to have a fortification, even thinking about the creation, the beginning of Islam, this idea that there was lots of wars right from the get-go. Muhammad basically had to fight wars. They have fortifications, and there's typically small entryways that only allow a certain number of people to be able to funnel inside. And this east gate is pretty characteristic of some of the other gates at the Mosque of Cordoba. I'd like you to take a few moments and just look at what are some of those common characteristics that we see in Islamic decoration. Thinking about our COG of our theme will really help you identify those different elements. So where do you see calligraphy? Where do you see calligraphy? I see carving of calligraphy way at the top, right in that band at the very top of it. It's hard to imagine that there's not more above the doorway. Yep, very common to have it in the doorway and on the framing around the door. Okay, then the O would be the arabesque. And so if you look carefully in the stucco, you can see carvings of flowers and leaves. You see rosettes. See rosettes in several places. Most of the arabesque is in this carved stucco area. Right? And then the geometry, you see geometry in these windows, right, with squares and circles and triangles, and it's not triangles, but diamonds. You see the star shapes, you see those interlocking patterns, you see the geometry with all the framing. And then very unique to this region of the world, we get a lot of these horseshoe arches, right, where they kind of come in rather than just straight down. And then these are the lobed versions of the same ones. But, very decorative, very pretty, lots of bright colors in those mosaics and brickwork. So when you are looking at the aerial view of the Mosque of Cordoba, can you identify the different parts that we just learned? Where is the minaret? Right, the minaret is right here, right? Then the courtyard is right there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Can you identify the Qibla wall? The Qibla wall would be opposite, right, down the end, very edge of that. And then where do you think the mihrab is, that niche that directs us? Right, it's right underneath this domed area, okay? The unique feature of this mosque is it does not point to Mecca. Instead, it points to Damascus. And if you look inside the garden or the courtyard, there are lots of orange groves. Oranges were really common in Syria, or still are common in Syria, and that was a reflection of their homeland. When they lost their power, they came from Damascus. So they have this pointed and orientated to Damascus rather than Syria, or rather than Mecca, I should say. Okay. So I think the only part that I didn't identify was the hypostyle columns and rows, and you can see how they have these gables. So those triangular shapes, those are all the hallways that lead you towards that Qibla wall. And if you look at the plan of this one, you'll see that it was expanded as they gained power 4 different times. So it was a rather small mosque, and then it was enlarged to the second and to the third, and then they went to the sides to expand it the last time. The innovative element of a hypostyle mosque is that it can really expand based on the population. Because it's really just a rectangle, you can always add to the end or to the side. The inside of it is quite unique. I think one of the first things you probably notice is those arches. They have that variation of color where they are different colors of blocks, and that was favored by the Visigoths who lived in this region as well. And so you see them alternating in those colors of Azores. A lot of these columns come from that Temple of Janus. So these are all spolia from ancient Rome. And they often have piggyback columns. So see how one column is on top of another? That gives the illusion of height, and it's decorative. So these are some really common arches that we see in Islamic art. At the Mosque of Cordoba, we have those horseshoe arches. Probably the most common form is the pointed arch, and this is actually stronger than a rounded arch. Christians will steal this concept from Islam when they start to use pointed arches in Gothic architecture. And then we'll also see merquanas, which are basically niches that have these scalloped decorations on the interior. So what happens to the interior decoration, as you move to the Qibla wall? Notice the one on the left, and then what happens on the right. The imagery becomes much more decorative, and it becomes more ornate. So notice how these columns, or excuse me, these arches are now lobed and have relief carving on them. Let's watch a video so that we can see some of this beautiful decoration as you go closer and closer to the mihrab. I apologize, the quality's not so good, but you can watch this again on your own. So notice how decorative it gets. Notice the power of the ruler being able to use the central aisle. Mascara there. So really this mihrab is just a niche. And then it has a beautiful dome on top of it. So one of the things that you notice is how opulent the interior was. This really does show the wealth of these rulers when they created it. And so as you get closer and closer to the mihrab, you get to this gated area where it's really separated, where people can't enter. It really just denotes the power of the ruler, but also the power of Islam, and that no one is really allowed entry into this sacred of most sacred places. And so as you look at the interior, you'll see how it relates to our theme, right? How it relates to our theme. And so you'll see calligraphy. Once again, notice the gold calligraphy in the bands of that dome. And then you'll see arabesque, and then you'll see that geometric organization and complex forms that are created. Obviously, without a strong knowledge of mathematics, these really complex interior forms would not be created. Right? So as you move towards the mihrab, all the decoration gets fancier, right? It gets much more complex, and that lets us know what the focal point is. So this one points to Damascus rather than Mecca. The last group we're going to look at from Spain is the Spanish Nasrids. And you can see that this is quite later. This is the late medieval period. And in Granada, Spain, there is a palace called the Alhambra. What does the placement of the city tell us about the Nasrids? So I think you can see it better here on the bottom left or bottom right corner here, that they built their palace up in a hill. Okay, we've been talking about hills in terms of them being places of like where the gods live. Here, it's the other. It's the idea of protection. So the Alhambra was a royal palace that is basically set aside for those who follow Islam. Islam was not necessarily the predominant religion in this area. There were Jews and Christians. And so anyone who was Islamic could be protected by the walls of the citadel and the walls of this palace in times of distress. So it was a quite large complex. You can see that they had their own citadel, and so basically they had their own armies. They had spaces for them to do maneuvers and to learn tactics up on the hillside. And then there was basically a series of 3 different palaces created by rulers. And so it was really just expanded upon. It's not like there was 3 rulers at one time. And so there's 3 separate. And so you can see that there are a lot of different courtyards and parts of it. And then the Islamic city, which they call Medina or Medina. Medina was, is just a term for the city. And if you remember, Muhammad, right, after he fled Mecca, went to Medina, and that's where he began basically his ministry. And so often the word Medina just means city. And so that's where people who did not live in the palace lived. They lived on the outskirts of the palace if they were Islamic, and then they would come in if they needed protection. So there were 4 different gates in order to get into this city. And the first 2 gates they face north and south. And then there was some other gates as well. And there's this great website that you can click on here and go to if you want to explore all the different palaces and all the different rooms. This is really an amazing website that I'm going to direct you to go to later on in your own free time. I think you're going to find it really exciting. Right? So outside of the palace, there's a series of gardens. And if you know anything about the Quran, or you know anything about the Bible and the Jewish text, that in the first book of the Bible, the first section, there's a story of a garden. And so the gardens represent the gardens in Eden. And so in the story, there is a series of rivers. Sometimes it's 2 rivers that intersect, sometimes it's called 4 rivers. And so a lot of water features were part of these gardens. We'll see these in the Mosque of Cordoba, but we also see this at like the Taj Mahal, as well as some other structures, and we'll see it in decorations as well. So the gardens represent the purity and the fruitfulness of the patrons. So you have several different images for the Alhambra, and probably the best known is the Court of the Lions. So this Court of the Lions has very unique sort of detail. One of the things that you'll notice is that it has very small columns, and then they have those large impost blocks that have like piers that lead up to the ceiling. And then on the walls, you see what this court is really known for. It has this thin, almost like gossamer, lacy detail that's all carved in stucco and stone. This whole courtyard interior and exterior, we saw it from the interior there, has all of this kind of like screen-like element to it. And it overlooks a dry garden that has a representation of the four rivers. And this is very, very common. You'll see that there's a channel carved into the ground and it's going into opposite directions. And then there's a fountain in the middle. And so that represents the garden. And one of the other unique features of this is that there's a second story. So underneath these projected cornices of the roof would be a covered area, and that's where women were allowed to enjoy the garden. Now the name of it comes from the water feature. And so if you look carefully, you can see almost lion-like creatures, and wondering why lions were allowed if those are living creatures. We haven't really seen representation of living things before. Is this a mosque? No, this is a palace, so it's okay to have representational imagery, but it does have a characteristic of how we denote detail in Islam. They're not particularly realistic. When I look at these, do I think lions? Not really. I think animals, maybe felines, but I don't necessarily think lions. And so you can see that they often are stylized and not realistic. This is the Hall of the Sisters. And this is a beautiful room that is part of the residential apartments. And so this has merquanas. It has that scalloped decoration on these curvilinear walls. And it's just so incredibly beautiful. This thin layering, it almost feels like lace, all carved out of stucco and stone. This is the El Muxar, which was an audience hall. Oop. I don't know what that is. That's interesting. Oh, there we go. It's an audience hall. And this was part of the fourth palace by Carlos Mexor. And he used this as his throne room where he would meet dignitaries from other lands. Here's the Camara's Palace. This is really known for its brightly tiled room. This also is an interior audience chamber. And this was the palace that inspired the work of M.C. Escher. Many artists or interested people know the work of M.C. Escher. And so he noticed that the amazing tessellations, those interlocking patterns of geometry, and he used what he learned from the Camara's Palace in order to make these really complex images himself. They're all based on this idea of optical illusion and interlocking pattern. So this is another example of that merquanas. This one is a music hall, and so it has amazing acoustics, and it reminds one of winter, almost like icicles coming down from the earth, or from the sky, I should say.